Hello, good evening. Welcome. My name is Miguel Amado. I'm the director of Serious Arts Centre in Cove, County Cork, Ireland. And I'm very honored, thrilled, and it's a privilege to be here with all of you today for the second event of the series that my colleague Jo Perkins and the artist Amanda Rice have been organizing. We are very pleased to have today the opportunity to hear from Jo, who's an artist, and will be introducing practice and developing this session with us. Georgia and Amanda will introduce the series now. We will be recording this session and we'll make it available online. Series is an organization based in County Cork and Cove, which is really committed to the development of critical knowledge about the world in which we live through different strands of program, including an online program that we are maintaining and that we want to even expand. It's a great opportunity for us to expand our horizons, enable discourse and knowledge to evolve, and through this kind of events, enable us to have a different understanding of the world in which we live. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Georgie and Amanda, who will introduce the series. And thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you, Miguel. I'd like to welcome you all to Fictional Reconfigurations and Embodied Transformations, a series of online workshops organized by Jo Perkins and myself, Amanda Rice, facilitated by the Serious Arts Centre. The series aims to depart from fiction as a tool to construct alternative worlds, not only addressing end-of-world scenarios, but potential ways of living otherwise that move beyond the violent currents of neoliberalism and capitalism. Through multiple different kinds of reshaping and restructuring the contours of what otherwise constitutes the alternative and imaginary, this workshop series explores the use of the prefix linguistic device re, pointing to the possible forms of resistance to the current crises of today by posing practical alternatives to the violent structures which bring about emergencies and calamity into existence.
The series features the artists Nina Davies, Becky Lyon, and Jo Pester, who respond to more than human intelligence, modes of communication, and agricultural practices. Over the course of 3 sessions, speakers and participants will use aspects of fiction and embodiment to rehearse dances, rebody earthly curriculums, and reconfigure interspecies communication. The workshop series will speculate on the potential for change in the present and conditions for a reimagined future.
The second workshop in this 3-part series is hosted by Jo Pester, a research-based artist working with video, sound, and installation, employing fictioning to create networks of embodied characters and stories. Her current research examines how language is shaped through the changing environment. She has an MA from the Slade School of Art from 2018.
Jo's workshop is entitled The Shape of Words, Worlds, Bodied Communication in Alien Landscapes. The session stems from her research into interspecies and more than human methods of communication by engaging with vibrations and disturbance patterns that convey auditory forms of cooperation and caution, as well as human mistranslations through the use of anthropomorphism in written text.
Just quickly before we hand over to Jo, I'd like to thank the Serious Arts Centre for facilitating and providing the space for us to conduct this research workshop, and of course the Arts Council of Ireland Agility Award for funding this workshop as well. I will now hand over to Jo and give the space to her. Welcome, Jo. Delighted to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks for the introduction, guys. So I'll just share my screen quickly. Has that worked?
Yes.
Great. Ok, so...
Aí na última, quem não entra, assim, a casa inteira da menina. Daí meu amigo pega e fala assim, daí ele pega e
will you put yourself on mute? Thanks. So hi, like Amanda and George says, my name's Jo, and I work mostly with sound and video. And this workshop comes out of my research into interspecies and more than human methods of communication. So before I talk a bit about my research, we could start with a listening exercise to kind of ease us into the workshop. So I'm going to share a snippet from the BBC Sounds podcast called Forest 404, which I'd really recommend. But I'm going to share a 3-minute snippet of a soundscape that brings together frog species from around the world. So while you're listening, you might want to try to distinguish between different species and their different forms of communications. Or you could imagine the things they're communicating to each other through an anthropocentric lens. It's really up to you how you respond. Maybe you just want to switch off and enjoy the frogs. And don't worry, I won't make you share any of your thoughts afterwards. So just enjoy it. Press play. So my research constantly returns to communication and language and how these categories are often used to draw lines between humans and more than humans. So language is seen as something superior that's reserved for humans and therefore outside of nature, while everything else from animals to bacteria to plants merely communicate. But in my practice, I'm always trying to understand language as something which, instead of being the thing that separates us from the non-human world, actually places us within a shared history in a messy, overlapping continuum. And I think some of the main perspectives that allow this sort of thinking come from understanding language as physical, embodied, as something rooted in the landscape through evolutionary processes. All animals communicate, and some with very complex communication systems. So an accepted evolutionary definition of communication might be a signal produced by one animal that's received by another animal in a way that the behavior of the receiver is altered to benefit the sender. So then what do we mean when we say language? Many linguists suggest that the main characteristic of a true language is that it can be infinitely extensive, and that there's only one way that this is possible, the way that humans do it. And that is the small vocabulary of words that use grammar to combine them in infinitely different ways to produce infinite concepts and meaning. But this exclusive categorization is a slippery one that doesn't hold up to the momentous gaps we have in our understanding of not just non-human communication, but also human language itself. To our knowledge, animals don't use words and grammar, but research has been so focused on this idea of words and sentences that we haven't yet deeply investigated the different ways animals might be putting information into their signals. So even when using sound to communicate, the way that other animals perceive sound is often completely different from humans. So an example of this is birds, who are relatively unconcerned with the sequence of sounds, but they're highly attuned to vast details inside each note, and how sound energy is layered into different frequencies. So they're able to pick out subtleties that the human ear completely misses. There's no way of truly measuring these communications against human language, and it's impossible to decode or translate them into human language. So much of more than human communication isn't accounted for, and what they're using their communication for with senses that are completely different from our own. So it seems a bit premature to declare that there's only one way to have language. So alongside this, my research also looks at humanity's history of attempted communications with possible extraterrestrial intelligence or aliens, and then linking this back to our usually anthropocentric approach to interacting with more than humans back on Earth, like trying to teach dolphins or budgies to speak English. Humans have put a lot of thought into communicating human intelligence to extraterrestrials, but would we recognize intelligent alien communication if we found it, or it found us? Is there such a thing as a universal grammar? How can we decode an alien language without context or a back and forth interaction? These are the sorts of questions are why I love the sci-fi film Arrival and the short story of Your Life by Ted Chiang that the film's based on. These sorts of questions can help us think about language and communication on Earth in more challenging and creative ways. Communication is almost universal for all life on Earth. Even bacteria communicate, and it's the physical and ecological constraints through natural selection that determine the type of communication that an animal will use. So, for example, different bird species use particular song notes that travel well in their particular environments. Tweets work well in woodlands where they need to penetrate through dense forests without distorting. But different species in grassland use warbles because warbles are more efficient, and in open countryside the sound waves don't need to avoid any of the obstacles that you get in woodlands. So communication systems evolve in response to environmental constraints, meaning that all language and communication holds within it its own history and processes of natural selection. So the main activity I want to try is inspired by a podcast conversation that I'm going to play a snippet of for you now, with the solar punk author Becky Chambers. And it's around both her and Ursula Le Guin's methodology for developing their fictional alien species. So just play that for you now. About 3 minutes long.
When talking about your own work and building alien cultures, you've said that you try to make sure that your stories are not human-centric, that humans are not the default template when you're imagining alien cultures. And you've mentioned how in Star Trek, all the species that they encounter have the same general questions as humans about marriage, about war, about religion, as if humans were sort of a default template. But despite the way we act about ourselves, we aren't even really the default template on our own planet. In many ways, I think the world of Left Hand of Darkness and the short story that we're also going to discuss that's in the same world, Coming of Age in Carhide, which she wrote a quarter of a century later. In a lot of ways, the references are human or recognizably human, the human concerns. But there is a science of the body that she brings into this culture from the non-human animal world. And it feels like this biological choice that Le Guin makes affects so much of the culture. On the planet of Gethin, which has a 26-day lunar cycle, for 24 days of each month, people are not gendered. They are sexually latent and androgynous. But there's a 2-day period called Kemmer, where they assume a gender, and not always the same gender each month, and where biologically their bodies are sexually attuned. So much of this society, culturally speaking, gets built around this biological cycle. And you too have said that when you're creating species, you often begin with biology first. So talk to us about that notion, starting with biology and maybe building culture from the biological.
I think that the whole idea that bipedal mammals are the default for the whole universe makes absolutely no sense. You don't have to go any farther than your own backyard to find dozens of species that reproduce differently, or that just move differently, live their lives differently. And so in my own work, what I typically do is start with one trait in particular. For example, my Eluan species in wayfarers communicate natively through color. They have chromatophores on their cheeks, like cephalopods here on Earth, squid, octopus, etc. They don't have vocal cords, and they don't have a sense of hearing. And so to them, color is language. And so from that, then I just take that and run wild with it. Then it's just, okay, so if color is language, if they communicate, non-verbally by just looking at each other's faces, how does that affect their art and their architecture? How does that affect their clothing if they wear any? What sorts of misunderstandings are going to come up when they run into other species that do use color just decoratively or have different meanings that they've associated with it? I mean, there's a million questions you can play with, and all of that builds culture. If you look at everything we have built around ourselves here on Earth, it is all determined by our own biology, what temperatures we find comfortable, what sort of surfaces we find comfortable, how we use our hands. All of it plays into that.
So I want to take this idea of a science of the body that evolves out of the landscape, from which culture and communication then develop. And I thought we could use this method to create our own speculative alien species and their communication systems as a way to disrupt the human-centric separation between language and communication. And perhaps it's a bit harder to begin with the landscape as opposed to the alien's biology in the way that Becky Chambers does. But that's what I'm going to get us to try. But first, I'm just going to show you a few examples of different communication systems that we can find on Earth for inspiration. So sound is a highly widespread form of communication on this planet, but it isn't the only system with the possibility of containing a large quantity of information. As Becky Chambers mentioned in her interview, cephalopods provide a really effective direction that an alien visual language could evolve, because large amounts of information can be contained within the color patterns and changes. Fireflies are another example of a complex visual communication, sending out Morse code-like flash signals through bioluminescence. And the use of bioluminescence counters the issue of distance that visual communication comes up against. So perhaps in our fictioning, visual communication might work well on a world with a crystal clear atmosphere and without any obstacles like trees. And if an environment where sound is less effective might also result in visual communication as a workaround for this. Chemical signaling on Earth dates back at least to the origin of multicellular life. Even bacteria can sense the chemicals in their surrounding environment. How might we imagine a smell or chemical-based language on our fictional worlds? Smell definitely has the potential to transfer information complex enough for language. Human noses have detectors for about 400 different chemicals. Dogs have 800, and rats can detect as many as 1,200 distinct stimuli. So the main factors to consider in imagining a smell-based language are largely environmental, because passive diffusion is slow, but wind speed would have an effect on how quickly and effectively the chemicals could travel. On a planet where winds are strong and reliable without changes in direction, and the environment is full of smooth surfaces, chemical signaling might stand a chance. But then how would the recipient send a message back? Fred Hoyle's The Black Cloud imagines currents of ionized gas that are used to send messages between the organisms. Electricity is a really great mode for communication, although only a very few amount of animals on Earth use it. And that's because it's a very energy-heavy process, which in many cases makes it less evolutionarily advantageous. However, electroreception, which is the ability to detect electric fields, is widespread among fish, including sharks, and also in some amphibians like salamanders, and even in some mammals. Duck-billed platypuses hunt their prey by detecting the electric signs of life that penetrate through their muddy environment. Electrical fish of Africa and South America can generate complex varying electric fields in the water around them in something almost like telepathy. So they use their generated electrical fields to sense the environment around them by detecting disturbances in the field in a similar way that we perceive objects by sensing light. And the fish have minute control over their electrical activity, just as humans have with speech. So electricity as a mode of communication might be present on planets where vision is useless, for example, in muddy or pitch black waters. Air's too insulating for electrical fields, so it can't be maintained outside of water. Although echidna have evolved a practical solution to this. So they coat their electric sensitive snouts with conductive mucus. Other communication systems might be dances, gestures, songs, land art, drumming, sonar, telepathy, or maybe something else. You don't have to feel limited to examples that you can find on Earth. So if you brought a description or image of an alien landscape with you, then feel free to use that for this exercise. Otherwise, I've got a few examples that you can use. So the first example as a starting point is that I've got is Titan, which is Saturn's largest moon. And Titan has a surface pressure 60% higher than we have on Earth. And that's the same pressure that a person would feel swimming about 15 meters below Earth's ocean. Its atmosphere is a thick and opaque orange colored smog. And sunlight is about 100 times fainter at Titan than at Earth because of the distance that the light has to travel from the sun. Its surface is smooth and craterless. It's a crust of water ice with a salty liquid water underneath. And the surface has liquid rivers, lakes, and seas, as well as vast regions of dark sand dunes that are made up of grains resembling coffee grounds. The next example I've got that you could use is this planet called HD 149026b. And it's the hottest known planet that we have in our universe. It's 2040 degrees Celsius, and it's absorbing almost all of the heat from its star. And so that means it doesn't reflect any visible light. And this means it's also the blackest planet in the universe. However, because of its heat, it does radiate a lot of infrared light. It's tidally locked to its sun in the same way that Earth is to our moon. So one side is constantly baked in the sun and the other stays much cooler. And finally, it's thought that the surface gravity could be as high as 10 G, which is 10 times the gravity on Earth's surface. And then I've got these images on the side of examples from the video game No Man's Sky. They're algorithmically generated planets if you want a bit more freedom with your imagination. So we're going to start by visualizing our chosen landscapes. You can either close your eyes if you want or make notes, and feel free to turn your camera off if you want, if it makes you feel more comfortable. So picture your chosen planet. What is the shape of its surface? Is it consistent and smooth or broken and rocky? Is it covered in mountainous canyons, ice plains, forests of indigenous fauna, or endless ocean? Now imagine being situated within that landscape. You might be on the planet's surface or perhaps submerged in a liquid ocean. Is the atmosphere or liquid that surrounds you motionless, or are there strong winds or turbulent currents? If you're in liquid, does it bubble with volcanic activity, or does it remain still and cold? What's the visibility like on your planet? Is the atmosphere crystal clear or dense and opaque? Are there any sources of light? Now consider the gravity on your planet. How would it force its organisms to move? Would they need bodies capable of the strength and dexterity able to traverse it? Or do they glide weightless with ease? Maybe they drift through a viscous liquid, taking in nutrients through osmosis. Are there any predators, or does life on your planet live in harmonious cooperation? Is it necessary to evolve methods of evasion, escape, protection, defense, or deterrent? Now imagine that you're a being that has evolved within this landscape. Think about how you might perceive your landscape. What sensory evolutionary path would be most effective within the environment? Maybe it's some form of visual organ, or touch, sonar, echolocation, chemical secretion, sound, smell, vibration, a combination of any of them, or maybe it's something else. So now I'm going to give you maybe 5 minutes, I guess, to take this sense of perception that you've imagined and imagine how it might be used within your planet's landscape to evolve for the use of communication. And I've just got some questions that you might want to think about when you're considering this. Think about how complex information could be embedded within the signals. How does the signal travel from you to others of your species? How would it be possible to have a back and forth interaction? And what sorts of workarounds have you evolved to offset the disadvantages of the environment for communicating? And then I think we've got a rise up. Oh yeah, George just put it in the chat. If you want to put any thoughts or notes in there, and we can share them after the 5 minutes is up. Is that working for everyone? Okay, so it's time about 5 minutes now. think that's been about 5 minutes, but I'll just give it a couple more minutes because I can see a few people are still writing. And then maybe some people might feel up for sharing their thoughts, what they've imagined. I don't know if anyone wants to read out what they've written or talk about it, or maybe if you have just thoughts on the exercise and you want to share them.
I'm happy to go first. Okay. So I guess I was thinking about I found it really helpful having the slides before of the various forms of communication which you mentioned, and so I guess I was thinking about pheromone communication and echolocation, and wondering about how these kind of thinking about signaling or communication happening sort of in between maybe chemical signaling or sonar signaling perhaps, and what it might mean to produce chemicals and emit calls out into the environment. I guess also responding to these questions too, I was sort of wondering about how to maybe complicate this inherent distance which is suggested through this how signal travels, and maybe if we close that distance, what does that mean in terms of how we communicate? I also thought about the final question about the disadvantages of the environment for communication. I was wondering about extinction in the context of the planetary emergency, and wondering about the loss of the receiver who has become extinct, and how what happens to communication and how it might continue or radiate outwards from the sender with the knowledge of not having the receiver, perhaps.
Yeah. That's really interesting because it kind of fits with this idea of like humans sending out all these signals into space, and not just like intentional with the idea of communication, but also it's like sending so many objects out into space, like Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster and things like that. There's no laws against what you can send into space, or even intentional, like with this is there even anyone still there to receive these signals, or, you know, if they do, it will be so far in the future that the people sending the signal probably will no longer exist. So how then do they send a signal back? What landscape were you thinking of when you came up with this?
Yeah, I think that's still a work in progress, I guess. I was imagining perhaps a forest. Yeah, maybe kind of, I don't know really.
I think it's really hard to do it that way around, like starting from the landscape. It seems much more natural to start with an idea of a communication system and work backwards that way.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I'm having trouble with, kind of going back to the sort of embodied exercise of visualizing the space, the alien landscape, and kind of seeing how that relates to these questions too.
I think I did it that way around, where I kind of chose Titan because I felt like there was a grounding I really appreciated. I think I found it challenging to think outside of like language and gesture and more human modes of communication, especially language. And I thought you really led us, the world building and the questions and the prompts really, and the examples of, I suppose, non-human communication that you presented really helped me, or gave me kind of a tool or set of tools to work with to try and, but it did take me a long time to try and start thinking outside of the box, which just shows you how kind of how dependent we are on our linguistic mode of communication, and slightly ableistic in some shape or form. But I was imagining myself in the Titan landscape and trying to find tools and methodologies for the problems of the landscape and how it could potentially shape the way I communicated, as I didn't even seem human. I was like this, I didn't really even know what species I was, but imagining ways of, I was thinking about, like, let's say the density of the fog, and whether that obviously has visual implications, but would that have sound implications? Would the density of the fog potentially implicate, any kind of sound communication that I might try, and even if it's kind of repetitive, or I was just thinking, I felt like I was problem solving in terms of how I might try and
I feel like that's how evolution works. That's how real communication systems evolve. So I'm glad that you went down that direction. Did you have like an image of what your alien species looked like in your head?
I felt, you know what, my species, or whatever I was dictated, I think, by the landscape. And in Titan, you described a landscape which was, I think, atmosphere dense. And I imagine myself to be quite sloth-like and kind of lazy. I was just imagining the physicality of the space, and kind of what my body would feel like in that atmosphere, and how. So I think I was thinking sound being kind of still. I was imagining myself as a land-based kind of creature that maybe I was thinking maybe sound, but then I started to open up and think outside of the box, and maybe think, well, we're an evolved species, and maybe think about some sort of signaling that involves extra-terrestrial kind of like mind communication that involved. It took a long time, like, as I said, to, I suppose, break out of this linguistic kind of language-based, language is too much power, as Karen Berard says, in terms of, linguistic terms, but yeah.
Which one was yours, the second one on the document?
Yes, let me just grab the document again. Serious workshop. Titan Saturn moon. So visual communication is problematic. Sound-based communication might be the most effective. As you can see, I feel like I'm problem solving. Morse code style patterns, often repetitive, to mitigate potential sound loss through fog density. atmosphere-dense environment would weigh physically upon inhabitants, which makes them less inclined to use gestural or movement-based language if land-based. I didn't even get to think around sea-based problems. Perhaps evolution might allow mind reading, or I felt like I needed maybe more time. It took a while to really start immersing myself in. Yeah,
I feel like this is just a starting point.
Yeah,
considering those things, and then you really need like a lot more time to.
Yeah, I got quite into it. I enjoyed it.
I don't know if anyone else wants to share theirs, or I could read some of them out. I feel like Tina, you're ready.
I'm ready. I'm ready to go. Yes. So I will just read what I wrote, and then we can speak about it. I imagine living in the waters of the planet Titan. The waters are covered with ice, and the whole planet bathes in a twilight atmosphere. The beings I imagine swim in waters where volcanic vapors and lava bring light and some heat. Communication is made by sound waves that are barely audible to other beings, but capable of traveling thousands of kilometers in both directions. A communication which is similar and goes hand in hand with telepathy. Interpretation of chemical secretion as a mean of expression, emotion cannot be ruled out. Secretion and sound circulating through the currents. Points of reference are used as specific biosignatures and message boxes. So basically, in your description of Titan, there was the ice and very, it's dark and it's cold and the pressure is high. So I was imagining in the water, and in the water, usually in our imagination, water is deep water are cold, but here I imagine some volcanic activities. And I'm very, of course, inspired, probably you by reading this, you're listening to this couple of lines. One remembers of whales. I was so I was thinking creatures that are either the first forms of the first fishes that later went out of in the Devonian age, the tetrapods that are went to the earth, to land. There was this evolution from water to land. So I was thinking something which is in a hybrid between a mammal of a whale and this early stage of water creatures that are very just before making the first steps on land. Yeah, and this idea of using the currents, this idea, which is, I'm very impressed by the whales that I have read that they can communicate between thousands of kilometers. I don't know how they do that, but they have a network of communication. So we can imagine what kind of impact human activities can have on whales if they are capable to communicate and to perceive other whales on more than 1,000 kilometers away. So I was thinking this idea of fluidity of something that is maybe also chemical, and it, of course, it's the way water creatures communicate with each other, like whales. For us, it's a kind of form of telepathy because we don't listen to it. And you spoke. There was two things that I found very interesting. Though you were speaking about the overloading of sending out messages in the space. And I was just today I've heard about a book called the title is "Deserts Are Not Empty" by Samia Heni, and there is the colonial perspective that the deserts are empty, and then the result is destruction, toxicity, and pollution. And now with the space, we have the same question, the same conception. we have the feeling the space is empty. We are sending out messages and lots of satellites, but it's probably also wrong, you know. I mean, in the desert, we are letting, I mean, colonial countries like France did atom experiment in Northern Africa, and the garbage is still lying there. And so there is nobody cares about the results of this. So this idea that maybe the universe is not empty, even if we don't know about it, so for sure. But we do know, for example, we are searching a lot on a planet. It's not a planet, it's an asteroid, or it's a moon. It's called Europe. They are definitely searching under the ice. So there is an ice surface, and they are very much looking if there is any kind of life, even bacterial, under the ice of Europe. And also to finish this, you spoke about interspecies communication, and also the obsession that we have in measuring intelligence by words and vocabulary. And I think that it's very important to think about emotional communication, emotional language, non-verbal. And this is, we know that we can communicate we can understand or have the feeling of a bond with animals through emotional. So probably this could be something to develop for the future, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess maybe we don't like to think about that so much because it's not really where like there are other animals on Earth that are better at that than we are. Thanks, Teeny. What did you mean at the end of your thing? What did you say? Specific biosignatures message boxes.
Yes. I was thinking that there would be some point. This would be like some proof of a civilization, which is like you know, some fishes they do like sanctuary, like something magical points where there is even some kind of sand architecture. There are some species making some construction, something magic at the bottom of the sea. And I was imagining that there would be we could let some messages at some certain point. It's not only about fluidity. There would be referent magical points, maybe of spiritual points in this in this waters. There would be biosignature as a message from somebody in your ancestors, something that's a message from other ages, or a message from another being, but that you go there and you know there is something to be understood.
I love it. That reminds me of Ursula Le Guin has a short story called
Good. Okay.
Ursula Le Guin. I'm trying to remember what it's called. Something about the acacia seeds, where it's set in the future where humans have cracked the code for non-human language, and so there's kind of whole research disciplines dedicated to finding these like left behind messages. And this story is about ants leaving like messages in acacia seeds, and then us kind of finding those all those years later.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it's a good one. I'll try and remember what it's called and send it to you. Yes.
What definitely happens today is that we are desperately looking for biosignatures on Mars, on Europe, everywhere. And I love this idea, the word itself, biosignature. It could be a bacteria, it could be a little bit of something, and some proof that there would be some life, or that there was some life before.
Mm-hmm.
And there's millions of dollars invested in this.
Don't know if anyone else wants to share theirs, or I can read them out. No.
Yeah, I'm happy to go. Yeah, I sort of imagined a planet that was like completely comprised by water or some form of liquid that was completely static. So in order to communicate, you would kind of like beam waves between two different beings. And as the sort of like ecosystem starts to like build up, you would have more and more. So I started to imagine sort of like myself like standing on a square, how many like signals you get from other people that are either like visual or like sound. So I imagine sort of like, instead of beaming those signals through sound waves or like just visual interpretations of like what is going on around you, all of these animals like evolving to kind of like communicate through like the waves. Because I think if you're there, or like if you're anywhere, there's so many signals that are being sent to us by our modes of like communications, that I just thought they could be not represented, but maybe other beings would have evolved to kind of like receive those wave signals through the environment,
Yeah.
as we do, because sound waves like travel through the space, but obviously those could be just, you know, the whole environment moving in and of itself. And if you had many of those as they kind of like proliferate through the ecosystem, you would have sort of almost like you have on a square or on like a public space where you have loads of different signals kind of like intercepting each other, but always with the whole environment sort of like moving in unison.
That makes me think of like there's a few species of fireflies that like flash in synchronicity, and it sort of like travels along the landscape through like this communal communication system, like a network.
Bit like the cordyceps in The Last of Us, if anybody's watching that.
Oh yeah, I need to watch that. I played the game. I love that, Leo. I feel like that's completely outside of our perceptions of human language. I think that's the end of.
I can just say a few words as well?
Yeah, of course. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, I couldn't really imagine a site, a location. Somehow it was as if there was like total abstraction, like there was nothing, either vapor, or solid, or so it seemed to be something that was totally just something that exists around me, but doesn't have any physical form. But the question I was more interested, that I was trying to think through more, was the one that you had here. Is it possible to have a back and forth interaction? So somehow I was trying to think about, is that whether we could actually avoid that, whether if you could have some sort of ways of communicating where there is not back and forth, where, say, if there is an output and there is another output, the convergence of those two could create a third thing that would then generate its own way of engaging in a dialogue, but without having to react to each other again, or as if the second output coming from me as a receiver of the response from someone or something would not necessarily exist, because it would form itself from from the meshing, the collapsing of those two signals. So that was like what I was trying to really think through, like, is it even possible to conceive ways of communicating without point A, point B, something that emits, something that receives, and vice versa. On the other hand, I think I was a little bit following what Amanda was talking about, maybe whether it's possible to just form, not like I use the word image to simplify, but something like form something in the mind that basically is what you are trying to convey, and vice versa, so that there is no need for either verbal or sound-based or movement-based tools to basically say whatever you want to say, as if everything that you want to think through exists in your mind and can be understood in this way. I guess mind reading is kind of way of putting it, and we saw that a lot in sci-fi, but I was maybe thinking something a bit more in a more abstract level, and not even physically rooted in a body or in the brain, something that doesn't have to have those recipients of something. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's really interesting. I think it's kind of like a lot of linguists argue that you can't have communication without a back and forth, or maybe you can have communication, but you can't have understanding without some level of context and like a back and forth. So that's why it would be so difficult for us to communicate with extraterrestrials, because of the time distance between the signals. There's no way of having that back and forth. So I think you've taken a very challenging question for yourself with that one.
Jo, I had a question. It's also kind of for you and Amanda, I guess. I just wanted to hear a bit more about how you tie in, I think, so some of your previous works you've looked at embodying an octopus or embodying a space, I think. So I wondered about how that kind of related to the work that you made with Amanda at the Intelligence Devised exhibition at Exposed, Magical Body, I think, as well as how that kind of embodiment relates to world building through your various projects.
Yeah, so that work was a sound piece that Amanda and me made collaboratively. And it kind of stemmed from this collaborative fictioning activity that we did together about kind of embodying a building and kind of all the inhabitants within the building. And this property manager, which was based on a job that Amanda used to have, that was kind of tasked with trying to control all the beings within the building, and eventually he kind of has to give up because of how impossible the task is, and he becomes infected with a virus that's inside the building, and kind of, I think he sort of merges with the building and starts to embody all the problems within it.
It's funny, actually. I never, this is a fairly recent work, and I don't think we've taken stock about the process since making it. But in light of this workshop, I think some of the things you were talking about in terms of landscape and how, what am I trying to say, how we problem solve around like species, hypothetically problem solve around landscape, and how that's how language develops. But in many ways, the subject of the short story was a building, and in many ways that had its own landscape in a way that had its own processes within that, if that makes any sense. Yeah, and I felt like not necessarily language and gesture, but certainly stories which emerges from that landscape and follows, I suppose, geological patterns or geological processes like leaks, arguably, or asbestos, I suppose, moving through walls. Yeah, I'm wondering how actually I feel like that was very much embedded in a linguistic kind of story rather than thinking of other ways of communicating. I felt like we covered anthropomorphism, or we gave voice to landscape, I suppose, landscape through our, I suppose, imposed like anthropomorphic voice on like geological processes within the building in a way. So
I think there's like not really any way for us to not do that. But maybe like in trying to find different ways, I liked how one of the ways that the building forces the property manager to communicate is by like slowing his time scale down to match that of the buildings. So kind of the signals traveling between them happen very slowly. So it's like bringing humans onto, like forcing them onto a different timeline as well.
In terms of other work, yeah, I'm just trying to think about the physicality of it. Had like other elements as well. It had musical elements, and when we think about signals, I'm wondering maybe what that means in terms of communication as well. It's such a different, it's not really communication. Yeah, I'm wondering how music, or like that was such a heavy part of that piece of work, or where that fits into question of communication, because you actually get that as an example. I think you talked about drumming, which is a form of music. I suppose music is a communication, so that's something to maybe think about as well.
Yeah, and I think music is another way that humans often kind of separate themselves from the non-human world, but like even through like the instruments we started with come from the natural world. And yeah, I think actually when in a similar way to the way I'm talking about language, it actually like completely embeds us back in the non-human landscape.
Yeah,
the evolution of it.
It's true, actually. In the first listening exercise, I couldn't help, but obviously it started with a frog chorus, but which for me had, I don't know, percussive kind of like, yeah, percussion kind of like, it seems to be in that kind of, not language or like trope of, again, anthropomorphizing, like, like, you know, animal language. I'm attributing it to like human instruments and noise things, like instruments built by humans. But yeah, definitely the birds, I was listening, I was I was imagining synth soundtracks, or kind of like, that's a great, it's so melodic. There was one bird at the end. I was immediately anthropomorphizing, kind of, it's not anthropomorphic, and I don't, what do you call that, but applying this human language of like song, or like this, like, I suppose, framework of song making or song building to, yeah, that was where my mind wandered very briefly actually during that exercise. I was like, oh, I'm imagining this, that would be a great synth riff, or like.
I feel like this, the podcast, the Forest 404 podcast that came from, they're very much like, and I'd really recommend that podcast. It has like a mix of fiction. I don't know if anyone's listened to it, but it has like a fictioning storyline, and then it's each episode is like followed by a more like abstract or artistic response to the story. So like soundscapes, or sometimes they have like lectures or like interviews with people, researchers in the areas. But the soundscapes, like the one I showed you, they are quite like manipulated. It's not just a field recording of the frogs. It, you know, there's been some manipulation, and that kind of links to the story within the podcast that I won't tell you about in case you want to watch it. But I think it's interesting that you kind of heard like there might have been some synthy distortions in it, you know.
also brings about just questions of miscommunication as well. I think how we maybe I'm just embedded, like thinking about maybe some of my own research at the moment as well around the problems with anthropomorphism and miscommunication. How do you see, where does miscommunication for you fit into, I suppose, your research?
Yeah, I think it's quite a big part of my research, definitely, in the sense that like maybe the site of miscommunication is what we could focus on. It's like, because then if the focus is not on interpreting the other being, you're not kind of like forcing it through an anthropocentric lens, or you're not like creating a power dynamic of humans like forcing non-humans into human language, if that makes sense.
So ethically, you're saying that miscommunicate, this slippery area.
Yeah, maybe miscommunication is more ethical.
It's more ethical in terms of how we interpret, like, attempts to communicate in a way, or make sense of like the non-human world, rather than anthropomorphizing the human gaze upon like the non-human subject.
I guess I'm thinking also about, just returning to music as well. There are these conspiracy theories, aren't there, of playing music backwards and then these hidden meanings that appear within it. And so I think kind of this, maybe that's purposefully misreading communication or reading it differently in order to create a different meaning, maybe. But unfortunately we're almost out of time. Did anyone else have any last thoughts or questions for Jo?
Yes, Jo.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just asking if the podcast you were mentioning is this Forest 404.
Yeah, I've just put it in the chat. It's
for the first one,
like
yes.
a BBC Sounds.
Okay. Oh yeah, thank you.
No worries.
So, Jo, I actually going back to when you were introducing your work. So let me ask a question. When you started working around these questions, were you more interested in, say, human non-human interaction, human and other animals interaction in the planet, or were you more interested in human non-terrestrial entities, speculative communication or interaction, and whether or not that's relevant, and whether or not there is a way of saying that experiments and research conducted in, say, humans speaking with dolphins has been influential or not in ways of understanding modes of potential communication with, say, non-terrestrial entities.
I'm trying to remember which came first, the aliens or the non-humans for me. But I think it started with like the non-human attempts at communication, but the kind of speculative thinking about communicating with aliens is more like a way of reframing the non-human questions in a more like maybe relevant way, even though I find thinking about like communicating with aliens in an abstract way really interesting as well. And I think the second part of your question about whether like history of attempting to maybe force non-humans into like human-centric ways of communicating, like forcing them on our terms to test whether they're like actually intelligent or not. Only like all of them were failed attempts. It's quite like old research. I think mostly it was happening around like the 60s which and it also coincided with like the history of the space race, and so I think they were quite linked anyway. But yeah, I think they just showed that you can't really learn much from that sort of thinking, in my opinion anyway.
Okay.
It's sorry, Georgia. It's just another minute or so. It's also interesting, like when you look at, say, mainstream Hollywood movies about human and aliens, like Spielberg, and it's like music, or in other contexts is like symbols. The film that you mentioned also, I remember watching it as well, where they were trying to develop a language in order to communicate, rather than thinking through. In a way, it is like first you have to have a vocabulary established in order to communicate, rather than thinking through, can I communicate without actually having to use vowels? You know, you see, it was that's so like thinking through more in a more abstract way, rather than having to resort to some sort of ways of inscribing language in some sort of material object, like culture or something like that. Yeah, it's interesting, like, because, you know, like, could we actually consider not having to use any elements that are sensorial, like audio, speech, smell, or whatever, to actually engage in this interaction? Could this interaction avoid all of that? Like, as almost as if we could have an interaction that doesn't rely on the body, purely on the brain. So yeah, it's interesting, and that's why I was asking about your interest in humans and other animals' way of interacting, because we also know a lot about, lots of research has been conducted, and still today, for instance, with some, like with other mammals, for instance, and how that may and how then you develop relationships. Okay, yeah, quite interesting. Yeah, really, really well done. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting. Georgia, do you want to say something before we close?
Yeah, no, just thank you so much, Jo. It was an excellent workshop, and thank you to everyone who attended. So the third and final workshop in this series will be hosted by Becky Lyon, and we will be there will be more information that will be announced soon. And I think Amanda is going to just include the Eventbrite link, maybe in the chat, or I can do that.
No, I have it here. Here we go.
Great.
Yes, thank you, Jo. Really, really thoroughly enjoyed the workshop, and thanks to the Serious Arts Centre and Miguel, thank you for facilitating us, and of course to the Arts Council of Ireland Agility Award for making this possible.
Yes, so, and yes, Jo, thank you so much. Really fantastic. I think we could go on and on. I mean, so it was really rich and experimental at the same time, you know, like, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us today, Amanda and Georgia, for organizing the series. And the session will be made available online, and hopefully it will reach out to others, and it will be also archived, so there will be a document that will be used by others and by us as well, in order to generate more ideas and discourse and thinking around these themes. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I look forward to seeing you soon, online or on site or anywhere else. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. That's a pleasure.